Okay, so we are going to wire up the bad motivator part 2 of the video. So these, I'm going to start little wires to big wires. These are the grounds to the buttons, and I've got all the pins ready to go here, and I'm just going to insert them into a single chassis. The reason I put them in a single chassis is to keep them from falling out, and I just coax it in there. Listen for that little click, and then I'm going to route the wires around the Nano and put it into the negative side of my power block. And the top wire coming down, there's two grounds. One is for the LED lights, and the other one is for the switch. And they don't really care where they live, as long as they're hitting ground. And so this one is the power, and this one looks like it's plenty long enough to go to the far side here, and it just needs a single chassis, but I'm going to probably gang load that into something else. Okay, crimp. Alright, so you want to crimp it so that the insulation just goes to the edge of these little wings that hold onto the wire insulation. Then I give that a little squeeze so that it's not flopping around. Then I put the crimp tool so that it grabs these front wings just so. Like that. And that's a good looking crimp. And what I've done is I've braided the wires that come out of the top just so they're a little less wrangly. Little tug. Alright, so this wire will go here, and this will go into the first slot. And I've got an empty hole here, so I can add another wire to that. So basically I'm building up all the grounds on this side and all the powers on that side. So that powers my LED, and I'll just route these wires over the rear just so they're not floating around on the outside exposed, and they'll be kind of taken underneath. So it'll live sort of like that when it's done. So I'm working my way from the top to the bottom. LED was powered. So to do the ferrules, those are probably the easiest, my favorite crimp. This is a 22 gauge wire. Put it in the 22 gauge spot and give it about that much. And you want these kind of both be the same so they don't create a weird kink in your wire. Always twist your wires so they don't fray when you stick it in the ferrule. So this uses another crimping tool. So black. Stick the wire all the way in. Crimp. Next thing to power is the 10 amp relay for the pump. It just needs ground and power to power the logic of the relay. So we'll put that here with the plus and minus going into this next track. So next down is to power the Nano. And I've got a wire made up for that. It's probably a little bit long. First two pins, voltage in and ground. So that will go here. And then here. So a quick overview. We start at the top with the LEDs. Those wires come in to the 5 volt. The next thing I power is the 10 amp relay for the air pump. And that goes here. And then finally the Nano into here. And these last two pins, minus and plus, will be used to put 5 volts into the whole system. And that'll be coming from the dome, the same buck converter that powers all of the LEDs for the lights in the dome and the servos. All right, so working from the top again, what I did was I took the LED signal in and I put in the same holder the signal in to the relay. And looking at my reference diagram, I can see that the LED is pin 6, and pin 6 is, this is 12, 11, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6. I put that in a 3-pin housing just to improve its integrity. And this big fat wire is the signal for the pump. And this is way too long, so I'll adjust that. I want to kind of live with this wire bundle here. So I'll do a little wrap around. And I want it to be about that long. So I will snip it. Then that is here. And you don't want to over tighten these, just snug so it doesn't come out and it's not loose. Okay, so I've got the signal for the air pump and the LEDs. LEDs are pin 6 and the air pump is pin 8. So now all of those are wired up. And the last thing to include is the reset button, which goes into pin 4. I made a special cable for the servo, which is just a male here and female on this end. This is the ground for the servo, and I'm going to put it into the ground, which is available on the Nano. To wire up the servo goes into pin 5. To get power to it, I put power into the main bus, but I'm short one ground. So there's a ground available on the Arduino. 2 pins, or the 3rd pin over from pin 4. So if I take this 3 housing and put this here, that way I don't have to count. I can just slide that baby in. Put that back in to the main bus. And finally, the signal for the servo is pin 5. Reset button is pin 4, and the pin for the servo is pin 5. So the skinny yellow wire here is my reset button. Pin 4 will be the middle here. When you're putting these in, you you can kind of look across the top of the casing and make sure that they're not sticking out. Like that one is sticking out just a bit. So I'll just kind of coax it in there a little bit with this pin. So the two last signals that need to get run are all the buttons. They start at pin 12 and 11, 10, and this last one is going into pin 9. I know it looks like a mess, but as an overview, you got 12, 11, 10 for the buttons for all the sequences. 9 is the smoke relay. Then we have 8, which goes to the air pump relay. This pin here that's blank is for the signal to from the main Arduino that will fire off the whole sequence. The next pin is the LED pin, and the last pin, number 4, is for signaling the servo. And everything in the 5-volt bus, double check that all the grounds are on the right and all the powers are on the left. And so now we have all of the 5-volt stuff powered, and we're ready to work the 12-volt system. So for the 12-volt system, we'll start with the smoke relay, and we got minus and plus. So we need to power the relay. It'll run on 5 volts or 12 volts. So we'll just run it on 12 volts since we're out of spaces on our 5-volt bus for grounds. So I'll just put it in the Wago. I've got some nice ferrules here. So we'll make the top rail positive. Give it a little tug, make sure it's secure. And the next one is negative. Now, you notice I've got 2 wires that are negative. What's going on here is the relay needs, the one I bought, needs a reference ground to compare it to the signal, and it needs a ground to power the board. So I just put both of those in a single ferrule, and that way I kind of save one ground. Grounds always seem to be at a premium. Next, we need to power the air pump, which runs on 12 volts. This acts as a switch, so the power routes from the 12-volt bus to the switch. When the switch is closed, it'll run into the common area, or the common pin, to the pump, and the ground just goes to ground. So it looks a little weird, and it's not, the power doesn't ever come from this side. This side is just powering the logic on this little board, and this side is the switch. That's the switch right there, and they're labeled normally open, common, normally closed. So depending on how you want the behavior of this relay to always be closed or only open. Open meaning that it's the switch has got an open gap, or closed, it's always closed. All right, so to power the hot end, again, this is our switch here. Its logic is powered by this 12-volt power and ground, and the signal comes off of pin number 9, and it also needs a reference ground. That's all going to this ground here. We, again, use the common, and this should be normally open. So we want to plug the input to our buck converter into the normally open pin. And we power it off of the DC, off the 12-volt bus. So again, the wiring comes ground to ground, and then positive goes into the switch, and then the switch will open and close and then send power to the other side. All right, so to test everything, I'm going to start with my 12-volt 3S LiPo battery. That's going to connect to the ground 12-volt bus here, right there. And then the positive side is going to go through this 30-amp circuit breaker and into the battery. And then for the 5-volt system, I'm going to take the 12 volts and run it through a 5-volt buck converter, and then that's going to power the ground and power of the 5-volt system. And that way they all share a common ground, and the whole thing should work with a plumb. So we'll start off with powering it up, and you can see I've got 5 volts here. All the boards light up, and the system looks like it's ready to test. So let's test the air pump and servo. This is the vape coil. Right now it's not connected, so we see the relay comes on in the whole system with the LEDs flickering at the top. Pump comes on, pump comes off, and then to reset. All right, so everything looks like it's working. And now to do a live test. So I use a little eyedropper to fill the tank, and I cover my the air input with my thumb to prevent it from leaking out due to an air gap. You want to let this stuff sit for 10 minutes if you have a brand new coil, so it saturates, and just kind of keep it covered up so that you don't have that leak out the bottom of the vape coil while it's still dry. Then to install it, just root the sealed thing into the chimney and attach the air hose. All right, looks like we are ready to do a test. Power. That single flash means that the Nano has booted its program, and we can test the air pump and the servo. We can test the coil, and then we can test the whole sequence. And if we wanted to do another test because people are taking pictures, we can fire the sequence again. And then when we're done taking pictures, we reset. And then put the panel back on. All right, looks like this thing is about ready to prime time. I'm going to remove my pump like this and set that aside so it doesn't leak all over the place. If there's no, you don't want, in fact I should probably make a little stopper so that this doesn't leak out with this air channel open. The main frame has plenty of zip tie anchor points. Use them to wrangle all the wires so there's no loose wires hanging around that could get caught in the moving bad motivator and cause grief or worse. So here's what mine looks like before I put it into the dome. The bad motivator is mounted onto the rear greeble in the dome. Make sure that it's fully seated and centered before you glue it. I just use hot melt glue in case I needed to pull the whole thing out for any design changes or maintenance. The blue braided cable you see in the top of the picture is the mag tag connection. It brings in 12 volts from the body. I take those 12 volts and immediately go into a Wago connector, which you see on the left side of the screen. This provides the 12 volts that go directly to the bad motivator. Then I go from that 12 volts to a 5-volt step converter or buck converter and take that into the 5-volt system, which then powers all the servos and LEDs, and again I send that to the 5-volt system on the bad motivator. All right, we'll call that a successful bad motivator test. Here's just being powered by a battery, going through the mag tag, and obviously there'd be a sound triggered by the Arduino. And just hit the reset button here, and it goes back in nice and gently. And then I find my panel